building on top of the Microsoft Graph? Cool. So I'm Gavin. Hi. Before I launch into stuff, who's actually played with the Microsoft Graph at all? One person. Okay, cool. Hopefully you'll learn something today. So I'm Gavin. My details are there. Feel free to tweet me. My email is firstname.lastname@teamintergen.com. I work for Intergen. I'm actually not based in New Zealand. I'm based in our Seattle office. Moved up there about 12 months ago. I'm a shameless SharePoint geek. I've been building on that for a while. I'm now a MOS MVP, Microsoft Office Servers and Services, because they retired the SharePoint label. So, what are we going to talk about today? We're going to talk about the graph, and we're going to have a little bit of an overview, talk some of the concerns, and we're actually going to go through the steps to build an application. Basic one, admittedly, and it's not very flash looking, but it works, and it does what it's supposed to do. So, what the heck is this graph? You may have heard of the Unified Office 365 API, or the Office Graph. Who's heard of the Office Graph? Okay. Does anyone know what the difference is between the Microsoft Graph and the Office Graph? So, the Office Graph is a rich set of APIs designed to give you information that's relevant to you, discovered through things like social distance and relevance, based on mined data from within your Office 365 account. The Microsoft Graph API includes some of those APIs, but it also allows you a wide range of access to data across all of Office 365. It doesn't get you all of that data, it gets you some of the data. It's almost all of Office 365, but not quite yet. So, until recently, we didn't used to be able to access any SharePoint data via Graph APIs. We can now get to sites and lists within SharePoint via the Graph using the beta endpoints. So the beta endpoints, they're beta. You can use them, but don't use them for production scenarios because they're subject to getting breaking changes. And some of them don't really work very well yet. But that's the point of beta. Get it out there, get people using it, find out what works, what doesn't. If you want to build apps today that are going into production soon, stick with the v1.0 set of APIs. They are production ready and not subject to breaking change. All access to this is secured using Azure Active Directory. Which is a great tool. If you have Office 365, you already have Azure Active Directory. You might not realize it, but it's there. The short version is it's a RESTful API for the modern web to allow you to access a lot of the Office 365 data. One of the key benefits that this thing confers to me as a developer is now I have a single domain that I make calls against to get Office 365 data, be it Exchange-based data, OneNote-based data, social data. All of my calls are against graph.microsoft.com as opposed to the Exchange domain and the Delve domain, because then I'd have to get separate authentication contexts for each of those. Let's talk a little bit about how authentication works for this thing. So authentication, it's a big deal. We have to plan for it and we have to do it right. There are two flows that you'll see typically. The one we're going to use today, or I'm going to use today, is the OAuth 2.0 implicit flow. This doesn't require us to write any server-side code to implement this flow. Effectively, our browser talks to the AD authorization endpoint. We type in our username and password. It sends that off and signs us in. And that token endpoint gives us replies back with a token on the end of the URL, which we can pull off and then use to authenticate ourselves on subsequent requests. This is great. It works really well for JavaScript type applications. There's a few small problems with it though. It requires you to sign in every time you launch that application because you can't store that token and it's not a long-lived persistent token. So if you're building add-ins for Exchange or Word that you want to use the graph for, you probably don't want to use this particular authentication flow and you want to use something that's a little bit more robust and gives you a longer lifetime for your authentication context. You'll probably want to use this. Oop, didn't relay that out very well, sorry. This is the authorization grant code flow. What happens here is instead of just getting back that token we're going to use for authentication straight back from our first sign-in request, what happens is we're sent back a code on that first response. We then use that code and the client secret together. We make an additional request to the server to pull back our tokens that we're going to use in future. This allows us to get what's called a refresh token. Now, refresh tokens are very useful, very powerful, and you don't want them getting in the wrong hands. So a refresh token lets me get an access token on an ongoing basis. So that refresh token, I can say, I'd like an access token so I can start making requests. That refresh token I can keep using for a rolling period of 6 months. So if I picked up a refresh token today, and in 5 months and 28 days, I used that refresh token again, I now get another lifetime of 6 months to use that refresh token again. So that refresh token, to all intents and purposes and usual use, has an infinite lifetime. The reason why we don't want to use this particular flow, and you can implement this just purely in JavaScript. Please don't ever do that. The reason why we don't is because when we make that request to get our refresh token, we were using something called the client secret. That word secret is the giveaway here. You should never be putting that client secret in a place where it can be freely read by an end user, like JavaScript code. You want to have that secured on a server somewhere so it's behind, hidden away from people prying, because that can be used to compromise your application and your authentication. Could be very bad. So, if you're looking to build add-ins, you probably want to look at this particular code flow. It requires a bit more work and setup, but it's definitely worth it. There's some really good blog posts on how you would do this in pure Node applications out there. But hey, okay, so everybody understand how authentication works, and the graph's just a big RESTful API that we can make requests against, puts, patch, post. Who wants to see some stuff? Let's build something. So, first thing we're going to do, like all good applications, let's make a wireframe. So, our application today is going to be very simple. We're going to take in an email address. We're going to use that to find files that person has sent to the user, and we'll give them the ability to select and save those into SharePoint. So, we'll click on the Find Files button. We'll throw a spinner up there because stuff's happening asynchronously here. Give them a list of images to select from. Click on one. Hey, instead of showing thumbnails, because we don't get that data, we'll just show buttons. We'll show the image, and we'll give them the opportunity to save that to SharePoint. Okay, so to do this, we're going to plan out the graph calls we need to make. We're going to use the Graph Explorer that Microsoft have up on their website. We're going to set up an Azure Active Directory application. we're going to use create an AngularJS application. We're going to use ADLE.js, the Azure Active Directory Authentication Library. We're going to scaffold this up using Yeoman. Actually, I won't show you that step because it's kind of boring and takes a while. And I'm going to use a thing called the NG Office Fabric material. Fabric. The material should have been deleted out of there, just to give me a tidy UI that looks a little bit like it belongs inside SharePoint or Office. You can use anything you want for layout. That's just what I'm using in this instance. So let's start with the Graph Explorer. I apologize, I'm going to have to semi-drop down a little bit because the computer's kind of low here. Great. Let's start with going to graph.microsoft.io. Graph.microsoft.com works as well, but it'll just redirect for us. Okay. So this is the site that provides all the documentation for how the available calls, the objects you'll get back, and you can actually play with the API in the context of this site. Just open up the documentation really quickly, give you a quick look at how this all holds together. Quick overview here, how authorization works, how to get started, and then sets of APIs that you have access to. And then there's a /beta reference. So if you want to start playing with some of the beta endpoints, click in there and you can see things like SharePoint data. So we can make queries against SharePoint now. In our case, we're going to be looking at mail. So we're looking at Outlook Mail, which gives me the ability to get messages. So if you click on a particular type of thing that you're after, it gives you a list of the operations. In our case, we're going to be looking at, how we get messages. All right, now somewhere. So let's go plan out the calls we want to make using this Graph Explorer. So up in the top here, we have this Graph Explorer option. I will just pump up the zoom. Can you guys see this all right in the back, or because it's quite a short room, or do I need to zoom in a lot more here? Cool. All right, so this loads. I'll just sign in quickly because I need to authenticate against this. Give me a sec here because I don't actually know the password to my own Office 365 subscription. That's what password managers are for, right? If you're wanting to play with the Graph Explorer and you start trying to use your work account, you might not be able to. I've already signed in previously with this account, so you didn't see that. What happens there is you get shown a consent screen. That consent screen says, these are the things I want that this app will be able to do. One of the permissions there can be controlled and blocked by your organization. So I can't sign in with my @teamintergen.com address because there's a permission there that's been blocked by my administrators. So you might need to set up your own Office 365 trial to have a play with this in its totality. Just a quick heads up. So the first thing is this API is user-centric. So you'll see here we've got graph.microsoft.com/v1.0/me. If I hit submit there, and that's not giving me any information. That's wonderful. If I hit try the messages endpoint. Okay, here we go. So you can see there's a little blue bar moving across the bottom of the screen there. That's actually indicating, you know, there's a request pending, it's taking some time, and I don't know why it's taking forever to respond there. Just going to open up here and grab a snippet of code out of here. Okay. So what I'm doing is I'm adding a filter to that request that was not succeeding for some reason to say, hey, we want to check that the email address that the message was from a specific email address with the address gavin.barron@teamintogen.com. So messages I've forwarded along to myself, basically. Let's see if we actually get a response this time. Come on, demo gods. Okay. That's not working so well today. Well, let's just quickly refresh the Azure page and see if we actually get traffic properly, because that's loading-ish. I tested those calls earlier in my hotel room and they were working okay. I don't know what's going on today. Apparently my sacrifice of bacon to my stomach this morning was not enough for the demo gods. Oh well, we'll just skip over planning the stuff using the Graph Explorer. Typically, I like to use the Graph Explorer because it lets me explore what's going on, see the JSON responses in line here, and plan out, hey, these are the calls I need to make to get at the set of data I'm going to use. Saves me having to, write code in a running scenario and actually debug that to understand what's going on. So this can be really useful to accelerate your development process when it works. So, next demo is building an Azure Active Directory application which will grant our users access into the graph. So they'll need to authenticate against this to give us a token. So we're going to use the classic Azure Management Portal here, mostly because I know exactly where to go in here, and the one that's in the new portal is in preview, and I still haven't quite got used to that bit yet. So I'm going to pick where are you? There we go. My Active Directory application on the right here. I'll just zoom this in a bit more. There we go. Is that, you guys read that okay? This user account actually has access to 2 different ADs. I'm just going to pick my gavinb.net one. Under Applications, you can see a list of all the applications that are installed or added to my Azure Active Directory. There's a bunch that come already provisioned, things like Intune, Outlook Groups, the Power BI, Yammer, and there's other stuff that I've been adding. So if I click on Add here, I'm going to choose I want to add an application that my organization is developing. And we'll call it Ignite, not something different. It's a web application. Now I get asked two things, the sign-on URL and the app ID URI. The sign-on URL is where should this application redirect back to send its token to. And the app ID URI is literally an identifier for this application. It needs to be unique. And there's a couple of little tricks here. So I know that my development machine, when I spin up this app, is going to be running at localhost on 8443 using HTTPS. Now the app ID URI, if I set this up in a specific way, I can allow this application to be signed into by users from any organization, not just my organization. So I can make what's called a multi-tenanted application. So we're going to use that trick. And what you do for that is literally use a subdomain of the domain that's associated with your Azure Active Directory application. So gavinb.net, that's my domain. That's where my blog's posted as well. But it's mapped to this Azure Active Directory instance. By creating this app ID as a subdomain, using a subdomain of that, it means I'm able to turn this on for multi-tenanted access, which means that users with an @microsoft.com email address can sign into it as well. So if you're looking to have an application that reaches outside of your organization, so you're looking to build something like a Boomerang or a Find Time type application, use that approach. If you want to keep it scoped within your organization, don't turn on multi-tenancy. But you probably want to use an ID URI that lets you turn on multi-tenancy later if you decide that that's something that's necessary. Click the start button, the check button. Hey, I've got an app. I need to configure this app. So we've got some information in here. I can set a logo for my app. I can make it multi-tenanted. I have a client ID. This is actually a really important piece of information. Client secret. There isn't a client secret yet. We're not going to need one because we're going to use the implicit flow. If you wanted to create a client secret and use the authorization grant code flow, you can create a client secret. Those client secrets have an expiry date, so you would need to create a new one at the time of expiry and update your applications. We won't bother with that. I can add multiple reply URLs, so I can have this one application and use it for dev, test, production by adding additional URLs that we'll reply to. And now I need to say that this app's actually going to have some permissions. So I click on the add application and I have a list of options here. So we want to add the graph and we want to add SharePoint Online. Because those are the two sets of resources we're going to need access to for this application. Okay, we haven't granted any permissions yet, so we need to pick what permissions these applications or this application will have. So in this delegated permission section, there's a big long list of options here. The one we need is actually kind of a risky permission. Why is that dropping away there? Oh, there we go. We want read user mail. I call this a risky permission because if someone gets hold of the access token for another user here, they can then go and use that access token, replay it to read all of their mail. So if that's your CEO's access token, you've probably got a problem. So that's why we've got to be really careful with how we secure these applications and manage those access tokens over their lifetime. The other permission we want to set up is actually against SharePoint. And we want to read and write items in lists in all site collections. Actually, I don't need the ability to write to lists. I just want to write items. The other one lets me create lists as well as creating items in lists. Cool, hit save. My application's ready. Not quite. I mentioned earlier we want to use the implicit flow. Because that implicit flow does have some downsides and some risks, it's not turned on by default in Azure. So what we've got to do is click on Manage Manifest and download the manifest. This is just a JSON file that describes our Azure Active Directory application. I'm just going to click on Open here. That's useful. I was hoping to get away with not opening Visual Studio at all this week, but some days the defaults are still there. So we'll wait for a moment while Visual Studio catches up with itself. This is why, so who uses Visual Studio every day? Most of you. Who uses a lightweight editor like Sublime or Atom or VS Code? Yeah. I would have preferred that to open in VS Code because I wouldn't have had to talk for a bit there to fill the dead space. So this JSON file literally describes our application that we've just created. And there's this line here, 15, OAuth to allow implicit flow. Set to false by default. And Visual Studio's not being super friendly today. We'll just say, let's save this somewhere else. Let's just put it on my desktop. Now that we've made that change, we just need to upload this file again. So any changes that we make inside this file, as soon as we upload that manifest, will be applied to our application. So you can just create effectively a blank application, pull down the file, do everything that I just did as via text editing. And we look for the JSON file that has some form of number to it. There we go. Great. We now have an Azure Active Directory application that's ready to go. Okay. One thing I will need, we'll just leave that open. So, because you don't want to see me typing all day, I've actually pre-written this application. It's all on GitHub if you want to pull it down and take a look. We just need to make a few changes so that it's hooked up to the right part of SharePoint and to our Azure Active Directory application. I used a Yeoman scaffolder for this purposes and built it using the Office generator. So there's a Yeoman generator to help you build Office add-ins. I used that as a basis for this application. Because originally I thought, oh, I'll build this as an Outlook add-in, and then I discovered all of the authentication issues and reasons why you might not want to use this particular approach in an Office add-in, and steered away from it. Excuse me. Okay. Just close everything here and bump this up. So what we've got here is our application that's been scaffolded up for us. The first thing we need to fix up is our app config. There's an ID here called the app ID, which is the client ID here in for our Azure Active Directory application. The other thing we need to change is where are we going to save this data to? So which SharePoint site, which list, what do we want that to go into? Under services, I have a data service. So basically all of my data access uses this Angular service object. And at the top of this, I need to fix up a couple of things. So tenant is Gavin B. Let's reuse the site from yesterday. I think it was SPFX, but we'll see because my memory is terrible. It is SPFX. All right. That is the correct URL. We're going to use a library called images. Let's just quickly go and create that library so we've got somewhere to write into. Okay. And there's one more piece of change that we need to make. In this ADEL config file, you can see here we've got a list of endpoints that this collection right here. So this says the ADEL.js library uses this object to say, oh, if I'm going to make a request against those endpoints, I need to make sure I've got an access token to access them, and if I'm making an HTTP request against them, I'm going to intercept that request and automatically add a bearer token into it so it's authenticated. If I don't have one, I'm actually going to kick off the login flow and force someone to log in. So because my SharePoint site isn't at tenant.sharepoint.com, I just need to update that. So now our app should work. I'm just going to run gulp serve here. This is going to transpile. No, it's not going to transpile any TypeScript because this is a pure JavaScript application. And it's going to serve up that web page to me. What's happened here is this application knows it needs to be authenticated to get data. So the first thing it's done here is kick me off to the login screen for my new application that we just created. That's why it says Ignite NZ here, because that's the title I gave to that application. You can add extra information in here so it actually tells the user what they're logging into. You might want to change your application so it doesn't kick them straight to a login screen, but shows them a page that explains what's going on and why they're going to be sent off to that login screen before this. But for demo purposes, this works. Now, again, I don't know my password, so use that sign in. Okay, now I have the world's ugliest UI, but it works. So, type in an email address. Click Get Files. Get that little spinner there. If the demo gods are kind today, we'll see some data. If they're not, this is going to be a short demo, which is tragic. I can only assume that we're not getting data. That's possible. That is, in fact, exactly what's going on here. So by default, Visual Studio Code doesn't let you save all your files at once, but I added a little shortcut for that. I just forgot to save everything. So, let's just restart this whole thing. Let's take a look and see what's happening here. What's going on? So, a silent sign, what? Okay. Let's just try something really quickly called in private mode. All right. Login screen again. Let's just pop our pop the debug window and hey, data. All right, so we managed to get some data back. That's a good bit of progress. One of the things I will quickly show you here is I mentioned earlier that because those requests were going to graph.microsoft.com, the ADL.js library was sitting there and intercepting requests and putting a bearer token in the header. Let's take a quick look at that. Who knows what a JOT token is? Okay, JWT, JSON Web Token. It's called a JOT token. It's the first line of the spec for the JOT spec. It's pronounced JOT. Okay, so let's just close that drawer there. You can see, because I'm super zoomed in, we have this header that's been added to this request. Bearer, authorization, bearer, and then this unintelligible string. This is the JOT token for me at the moment. What this is 3 base 64 encoded strings concatenated together with periods separating them that describe who I am and where that information has come from. If you want to see what's inside these, the easiest thing to do is go to jwt.io. Then you can just take that, paste it into the window here, and it automatically decodes it for you. So it gives you this nice color highlighting. You've got the red section, which is a header, which describes what's in this, how it's been encoded. The purple section, which is actually the body, which is a set of claims described in JSON format. So here we can see my app display name is Ignite NZ. We can see my name, the IP address that I'm coming in from, and here we can see this SCP, the scopes. I have allsites.write, mail.read, and user.read. So those are the scopes that we set up, the permissions that we set up in our Azure Active Directory application. So if I try and make a request that I don't have one of those scopes for, so if we just jump back to the graph documentation here, one of the things that they call out, let's just go for personal contact and pick on contact, list contacts. So one of the things that they do call out, oh, not on this one. One of the ones I was looking at earlier, usually they'll tell you which particular scopes are necessary to make particular calls. At least the SharePoint one that I was looking at earlier. Anyway, There's specific permission. If you need a specific permission, it's described as a scope in that JOT token. So let's just go back on script and pop that across and zoom it out. So one of the things I've done, because I find it really useful for debugging purposes, you can see the JSON that I have rendered down there in the bottom. In Angular, it's really easy to get a nice formatted output of JSON for any request. If I select an image, it'll go off, query the API to get that specific image. It's a photo of my family and I in Croatia earlier this year. I can click Save to SharePoint, which will reach out across the wire and save that into SharePoint. So if we go back to our images library and refresh here, we have that image that I've just uploaded there. So, who's curious how this all works? Because I didn't get to show you the all the web API calls we would have been making via planning everything on the Graph Explorer, let's just go into our home. So all we've got here is some HTML that describes the view. But the most interesting piece for most developers is going to be this little bit down the bottom, this pre-VM data object pipe JSON piece. That's what gives me that nice formatted display of JSON data in mine. So this can be really useful for debugging if you, instead of having to attach a breakpoint to see the responses that are coming back over the wire, just chuck one of these into your Angular application to show exactly what data you've got. Super useful. So my controller here has real simple bunch of actions that call into this data service that we saw before. So we have, load data, view, and upload. Our data service, load data, calls this data service.getData and passes stuff along. All right, so let's take a look at what's happening inside our data service here. We describe ourselves, so the way that this service works is it describes itself by binding, by returning an object that describes the functions that are available. Quickly find get data. So this is our top level call into this function. It's making a call to find email addresses sent to me from a particular email address. And I've also added this additional filter of has attachments true, because we're making big calls across the wire. We only really want to get the data we care about. I don't care about emails that don't have attachments, so filter them out. So that's one of the principles you should be thinking about as you build graph apps. Use filters to exclude any data you don't want to pull back across the wire. This is going to give me, all of the emails that contain messages. Doesn't give me the messages though. What we then do is we take that response and use this thing called map. What map does is basically, there's a library called Lodash, really useful library if you're in JavaScript land. Think of it as a link for JavaScript. But what this lets me do is, for each item in a collection, pass them off to another function, and then all of those, they'll be returned. So calls off with each message, I call off to get all of the attachments that are hooked up to that message. Jump to get attachments. So we make a call to load up that collection of attachments for that email. You'll see here I've got a filter added there that should restrict the set of data that's returned just to image content type images. So I'm not going to return Word documents and things. Unfortunately, that filter doesn't work at the moment. Hopefully the team will fix that. But one of the things you want to be aware of with this call to get the particular set of attachments is those attachment objects by default will return you the content of that attachment. So if you've got an image that is, 4 megs, that response will come back with a 4 meg image embedded in it. So that's why with that last line there, we use select. So we're going to say we want to get the content type, the ID, the name, and the size of the file, rather than getting the whole file. So that lets us render that nice row of buttons without having the overhead of getting all of those images in the first place. Then when I clicked on that button, I would load a specific image, which is the next one up, get attachment. So here, because I've got the ID of the email and the ID of the attachment, I can literally just make a request for those, get the content type back and the array of bytes for that particular image, which lets me render that nice picture in line. Nice and easy so far. I've actually got a little trick with that one in the home controller in view here. So you'll see this line. So all I'm doing is literally, instead of putting a link to some file elsewhere, I'm actually doing an embedded image using the base64 encoded set of bytes. It's a nice way around that problem, so I don't have to rehost that image somewhere that's addressable via URL. And then when I click that upload to SharePoint button, I have this save file function in my data service. So this one does a couple of tricky things. So work out what the address that we need to make it. So it just uses the standard SharePoint RESTful APIs to write data. But one of the tricks here is that set of bytes that we were sent is a base64 encoded set of bytes. We can't just save those straight into SharePoint because it'll result in a corrupted file and you won't ever get it back. So I've got a little helper function, array buffer to base64, which basically translates that into a format that will save successfully into SharePoint and allow you to actually open the image and view it again rather than mangle it as it goes away. All right, that is pretty much how that code works. So, questions? I'm sure there are some. There must be. Yes. So what that interceptor, what happens is it hooks itself up to the HTTP client. It registers what's called an so the $HTTP service in Angular allows you to register a thing called interceptors, so that when you make a request, that piece of code is invoked. What that interceptor does is say, hey, you're trying to make a request against that endpoint. You're in the list of endpoints that I'm going to, I'm registered for. I have an access token. Okay, well, I'll just add that into the header. I don't have an access token. Well, we'll kick off that flow and go back to it afterwards.
I want to go back about what you said before about the client secret.
Yeah.
When that expires, is there an automatic notification?
There is an automatic notification to you as the app developer. I've had a couple of them expire, and I've received emails from Azure saying, "Hey, these are going to expire." I wish all of the services that worked in that manner did so, but yeah, you should get a notification. I have in the past anyway.
And what would be the what do you recommend storing that secret on the client? The best way to store it?
So, one, that secret should never go into a client application. If it's going to be sent into a browser, no. If it's going to be sent, I'm going to I personally don't like the idea of embedding it in a ZAP file if you're making an Android application. Some people are okay with that because they're like, well, that's been heinously reverse engineered. I'm not a fan. That should be on a server somewhere if you're using the authorization code Grantflow, in my opinion. People will argue otherwise and say, well, someone's gone to great lengths. We're not storing any data that's really risky. I'm like, yeah, you shouldn't do that. The Graph App API is very comprehensive. I've only scratched the surface of what's possible. Unfortunately, I haven't had a client who's really needed those capabilities, but they're vast. Who's seen the Boomerang or FindTime applications? Okay, so FindTime is an Office add-in for Outlook, which allows you to go, well, I need to create a meeting with a whole bunch of people. I don't necessarily have access to their calendar. Look at my calendar, give me a list of things, let me set up a vote, and if other people are subbed in, you can actually share availabilities and things like that. So there is a vast host of things. Unfortunately, every time I start talking about this with some of my customers, they go, well, we don't quite need that level of complexity. Hey, anybody else? Yeah. Can it use on-prem SharePoint as a data source? No, but not currently. There is plans to ship hybrid connectors which will expose some of the on-premises SharePoint data via the graph. So I believe that's targeted for one of the next feature packs for SharePoint 2016. I don't think you'll ever see that in any earlier version. But yeah, there are plans to expose on-premises data via the graph under work. It's just not available yet.
But in this case, you need to have 365 subscription, right?
You need to have an Office 365.
For the hybrid model.
Oh yes, yes. SharePoint Online's the gateway drug to hybrid. Honestly, I've been working with Office 365 for quite some time now, and I'm less thrilled when I need to work in a purely on-premises environment now. Hybrid's fine, but cloud is where new things are happening faster and more often. I acknowledge that that's not possible for everyone, but if you're able to have an Office 365 subscription, it's very worthwhile because it also covers all your CALs for your on-premises SharePoint users. Hey, thanks everyone. Please fill in your evals. Tell me what you thought. If you have suggestions to improve, please tell me. If you thought it was awesome, tell me. If you thought it sucked, tell me. Cool. Thank you, everyone.